Okay, now we want to talk about the scientific method. So this is going to be a systematic way of conducting an experiment to learn about stuff. So depending on which website that you go to, you're going to get different definitions of the scientific method. But the one that I chose is the scientific method is an organized way of solving problems. And so here's a little flow chart that shows you how the scientific method works. So the first step in the scientific method is to make an observation. So I'm going to observe that if I take this thing and let it go, it falls to the ground. So that's my observation. Then that observation ought to generate a question. So my question is, why does this thing fall when I drop it? Okay, then that generates a hypothesis, which is going to be the answer to that question. And of course, it's magnetism. No, it's not magnetism. I think you know what it is. But let's just assume that we don't know what is causing this thing to fall, and so my hypothesis is going to be magnetism. Okay, then my next step is to do some research. So if I think it's magnetism, then I'll go to the internet and do research or check out books about magnetism. Okay, then the next step is to come up with an experiment that is going to test the hypothesis. And so my experiment is going to be that I notice that this thing fell and it's being attracted to the table, so maybe the table is magnetic. So therefore I'm going to take my table, I'm going to lift it up, I'm going to flip it over, and then I'm going to take this object, I'm going to hold it underneath the table, and I'm going to let it go, and then if it's magnetic, it will go up to the table. And then when I do the experiment, it didn't work. Okay, so that means that I need to either change the hypothesis or change the experiment. So another thing I know about magnetism is it depends on distance. So if you got two magnets and you hold them like here, they generally don't go together. But if you get them close enough, then they'll attract each other. So maybe I just wasn't holding the pen close enough to the table. And then I conduct the experiment and it still didn't work. So all of these experiments are failing, so that means I need to change my hypothesis. And so this time I'm going to change it to gravity, okay? And then I will come up with some kind of an experiment to test that hypothesis, and lo and behold, this time the hypothesis works. Now, it doesn't mean that the hypothesis is correct. It just means that that hypothesis worked for that particular experiment. Okay, then the next step in our scientific method is to publish. So once you think you understand this concept, then publish it so that other scientists can look at it to make sure that it is correct. Okay, here are some definitions that go with the scientific method. So what is a scientific fact? It is a repeatedly confirmed observation that is agreed upon by competent observers. Okay, then you also have the scientific hypothesis, which is a temporary explanation to a phenomenon or an observation. So it's a temporary, and then if, however, this hypothesis works for each of these experiments, then it can become a scientific law. Now, a scientific law describes or predicts a wide range of phenomenon, but it doesn't explain it. So that's what a scientific theory does. So, for example, the law of conservation of mass, which means that if this thing weighs or has a mass of 10 grams, and then I pull it apart and this has a mass of 9, then this has a mass of 1, so that you can't create or destroy mass. So that would be conservation of mass. Now, later in our physics classes, we would learn about E equals mc squared, where mass can be turned into energy and energy can be turned into mass. So we would need to modify that and say conservation of mass energy. That's what's really being conserved. But a scientific theory explains some kind of phenomenon. And so, for example, the theory of relativity, the special theory of relativity, and the general theory of relativity, which you'll learn in your physics classes. Okay, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about problem-solving strategies.